So this was recorded and scripted over the course of like maybe 3 to 4 days before the Nintendo Direct, which came out the day that I'm recording this. This is unscripted. This is just me going off rip. Yeah, this was recorded like the day before the Direct came out, and then all of this happened.
Princess Peach will star as the main character in a brand new game, visually enhanced version of Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm.
What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm!
Is it coincidence? Absolutely. I just wanted to pop in here right before the actual video started and talk about this briefly because I thought it was kind of funny. Yeah, Elephant Mario. But yeah, I just wanted to pop in here real quick and just mention this briefly because I thought it was funny. Now on to the actual video. So not too long ago, I talked about a variety of different video game, comic, and manga adaptations, giving all of them a brief overview and encouraging those who may or may not have heard of some of them to give them a try and see if they were interested. And in that video, I briefly mentioned the fact that Ian Flynn, famous for his work on both the Archie and IDW Sonic comics, Sonic Frontiers, and the Archie Mega Man comics, pitched an Archie Super Mario Bros. Comic line to Nintendo, only for it to get turned down. Ian himself even made a list of tweets going over the plot of the first 4 issues and what they would be about. But at the end of the thread, he said something pretty interesting. Quote, "Looking back on it now, it's not how I'd approach a Mario project today. Too much drama, not enough whimsy. Still, I thought some of y'all might get a kick out of it." End quote. That quote got me thinking. The Mario games and universe are pretty good grounds to make an interesting comic run. But how could you create an interesting and engaging comic series based on Mario while still staying faithful to the original source material? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. Taking inspiration from the games, the movie, and various other miscellaneous Mario media, as well as other successful video game comic projects, to try and figure out what would be the best way to approach a Mario comic series. Are you ready? Well then, let's-a go! God, that sounded dumb. Starting off strong, first is the story. Because what's a good comic line, or a good work of fiction in general, without a good story? Now, you might think that a Mario comic might be the hardest to come up with stories for, since no one really plays Mario games for the story, but that's where you're wrong. Ian went on record to say for his Mario comic pitch, he based the 4-issue pilot off of the original Super Mario Bros. Game, but leaving the door open for a continuation if the comic was popular enough. You might think that that's just me taking the same idea he had for that comic in particular, but he did the same thing with Mega Man. The first arc in that series is an adaptation of the original Mega Man game, and the next few arcs are also adaptations, or at the very least take inspiration from various games early in the franchise. It's an effective strategy for a video game comic series to start off with, since you're opening the story up with beats and plot points the reader is familiar with, getting them comfortable with the setting before slowly branching out and doing your own thing with the world and characters. Now for me personally, I'm not sure how a completely original story arc in a Mario comic would fly, since that would require you to come up with new concepts, new plots, and probably new characters to fit in as well. And that would be extremely hard to pull off without it seeming like a shoehorn or some sprite animation fanfiction. Now, you might say, but Sonic and Mega Man make original arcs and those worked, and you're right. All 3 series had successful original arcs, but they succeeded for very different reasons. For one, Archie Sonic in and of itself was mostly original, since it wasn't building off the foundation of games outside of just introducing characters and implementing plot lines. A majority of Archie Sonic stories are done entirely on their own, in its own separate universe disconnected from game canon. IDW, and to a lesser extent Archie Mega Man, succeeded because for one, Sonic and Mega Man as a franchise play mostly fast and loose with their canon, so they can afford to take those creative risks and do their own stuff. Meanwhile Mario, its universe, while not being heavily story-based, is so tightly knit and distinctly different that trying to create an original story with original characters might come off as jarring or shoehorned unless handled very carefully. Also, while Sonic and Mega Man games and their universe are generally more grounded, Mario is a bit more cartoony and lighthearted, so trying to implement those kind of original stories might be hard without it being this big tone issue, which we'll talk about tone later, but yeah. In my opinion, the best way to handle the story in this hypothetical Mario comic is to adapt the stories of already existing games and flesh them out and connect them together. This way you're sticking mainly to the original source, adding some original elements and giving it more of a narrative hook to keep readers engaged, and also just have it not be just the games in comic format. Plus, there's so many Mario games that you would basically never run out of stories to adapt. Sunshine, 64, Galaxy, the Mario and Luigi games, Mario RPG, Odyssey. Heck, you could probably make a spin-off of Luigi's Mansion and Paper Mario if you wanted. There's a lot you can do with the games. You'd need to flesh it out more and give it more character and narrative beats though, since while no one plays Mario for the story, comics are going to need a narrative element to keep the readers engaged, or they'll just get bored. Because why read a comic based on a game when it's just the game when you could just go play the game yourself, you know what I mean? Pokemon Adventures is an actual great example for this. It takes the original foundation of the games it's adapting, stays close to its story, more or less, and adds more interesting narrative beats and character development to help it fit more into a manga format. You'd also need to find a way to fit all of these stories together into one big story, since everything will feel pretty disconnected otherwise. Dragon Ball Super had a really big problem with this during its run. None of the arcs are connected to each other, so it just feels like the writers just hit the reset button at the end of every story and starts fresh at the beginning of the new one. Granted, given the nature of Mario games, you probably could get away with starting fresh between every story, but for me personally, I like it when arcs lead from one to another. You'd probably also need to change some stories around some, so the story isn't just Princess Peach getting kidnapped over and over again, because in a game that's fine, but in a comic format, I feel like that'll get old really fast. But other than that, yeah, that's a pretty in-depth breakdown of how I think the story of this comic should be handled. Now, on to the characters. Now, on the surface, there's a lot of characters you can bring into this hypothetical comic series. Heck, there are even images of concept art and character sheets of characters that were going to be in the original Archie comic. Mario, Luigi, Yoshi, Peach, even Bowser and Wario. But you can also have characters like Toadsworth, Kamek, the Koopa Kids, Daisy, Rosalina, Donkey Kong. Lots of characters you can play around with. But what good are those characters if they're not interesting? Now, you might think it would be hard to try and make personalities out of all these characters whose personalities could be more or less summarized in 2 sentences, maybe 3. But I think there is an easy way to expand upon these characters. The Super Mario Bros. Movie gave us an example of what these characters would look like if they were expanded upon besides the basics. Mario, Luigi, Peach, Toad, DK, and Bowser all have more established personalities and character traits that make them more appropriate for a more linear story-based adaptation. But, as I'm sure as you saw in many reviews of the movie, including my own, while they are more established than their game counterparts, they aren't exactly fleshed out besides the basics. And while that wasn't really the point of the movie and the characters worked well in the movie for what they were trying to do, for a long-running comic book series, you definitely need to add more on top of that. Take better effort in exploring the relationships between the characters. Going back to Ian's quote about him handling a Mario project differently, he says that he would pull back on the drama aspect of his original pitch, since in the pilot, Mario and Luigi have a falling out right before they go into Bowser's castle, only for them to reconcile right when Bowser's about to beat Mario. I agree with Ian's statement here. The Mario movie showed that this is the ideal interpretation of Mario and Luigi's relationship. No overused 2 best friends break up at the end of the 2nd act before coming back together during the 3rd. They love each other, they support each other, and they care about each other no matter what. And I think that's the right way to handle it. You can still have them disagree every now and then, since, they're siblings. Trust me, as an older brother myself, I know what that's like. But, as long as they keep their core theme of always being there for each other, I think it'd be fine. There are plenty of other character relationships you can expand upon too, like the romantic relationship between Mario and Peach, or Luigi and Daisy if you want, the father-son relationship between Bowser and his kids, Peach and Toadsworth's father-daughter-like relationship, the list goes on. There's a lot you can do with specific characters and their relationships to help be engaging on a personal level with the readers. And honestly, seeing more fleshed out versions of these characters I've more or less grown up on would be really cool to see in a comic format. The next big thing that's important for a Mario comic, or any story in general, is tone. Now you might be thinking, Grove, what does tone have to do with this? Well, everything really. The key thing about a Mario comic is finding a tone that's able to stay true to its lighthearted and cartoonish adventures of the Mario universe, while also trying to introduce stories and stakes that will keep the readers engaged. Having a good and consistent tone is really important for making a story, because if you try to set up a story one way, but the tone is completely different, it could be really distracting for the audience. For example, let's look at my favorite place to go for poor writing decisions, the modern MCU.
Ah, boy, here we go.
The MCU is completely incapable of letting a serious moment breathe. They're afraid that if people aren't cracking jokes and delivering punchlines every 10 seconds, the audience is going to get bored and watch something else. So, they constantly feel the need to undercut every serious or sad scene with some kind of quip. You can see this in a lot of their recent projects like Thor Love and Thunder, Multiverse of Madness, Moon Knight, Black Widow, etc, etc. But my personal favorite example is actually the zombie episode of What If, which is framed to be this super tragic story. All of these characters are witnessing their close friends and family turn into mindless zombies, every society's gone to crap, and then...
The zombie apocalypse!
Guys, I'm covered in Sharon.
Whoa, watch out! She's a man-eater! There it is! I'm doing it again!
Don't eat me!
Hope! Another W on the board for the Avengers. Go ahead, high five. It's okay, I won't feel left out.
It's just constant quips. It can't decide if it wants to go for a more tragic tone or a more campy tone. So it just decides to do both, and it just doesn't land. Anyway, putting that rant aside, a consistent tone is important. So what should the tone be for a narratively driven Mario comic? Well, Mario is known for its lighthearted and whimsical adventures. So I think for the most part it should stay true to that. But the comic shouldn't be afraid to tackle some darker or sadder subject matter, or tackle more interesting themes and ideas compared to the Mario movie, for example. Mario is no stranger to dark and sad beats in their stories. It's not as frequent as in Zelda or in Metroid, for example, but they're around, even though a lot of it is in more of their spin-off games. But the biggest one that comes to my mind is Rosalina's backstory, which is one of the most heartbreaking stories in any Mario game, in my opinion. But yeah, in short, the tone for this hypothetical Mario comic should be primarily whimsical and lighthearted, but be unafraid to change to a more serious or dark tone depending on the scene or story. And lastly, art style. Since if you're making a comic book and don't have a definitive art style, you might as well be writing a book. Now, art style is a bit more difficult to pin down in terms of what's best for a Mario comic objectively, since art is really subjective. And if you're talking comics, you're also getting into paneling and page layouts and stuff which I do not have the knowledge or experience to talk about effectively. But, in terms of what kind of art style I would like from a Mario comic, I think something colorful, vibrant, and is able to capture the spirit of the games and characters really well would be appropriate. Personally, I think the concept art and released images from the original Archie Mario pitch look really good, and is basically everything I'd want from a Mario comic in terms of appearance. I don't know, I'm not an artist, nor do I know anything about art and comic paneling or any of that sort, but I did feel like this would be an appropriate section to add at the end, since I feel like a consistent art style is important for making a good comic, especially one based on an established IP. In short, do I think we're going to get an officially licensed Mario comic anytime soon? No, I don't think so. While Nintendo has allowed comic and manga adaptations of their properties to be made in the past, I think Mario is too precious for them to take a risk like that, even though they could definitely afford to. Plus, I think with how successful the movie was, they'll just worry about making new movies of that universe now, instead of trying to spend more resources to make another alternate Mario universe, except this time on a comic. But I think Mario, as a comic, could be done right, if the things I listed throughout this video are stuck to, more or less. Keep in mind, I'm not a professional writer, I'm not an expert on what makes a good comic or a successful comic. I just thought this would be a fun topic for a video, and if you disagree or think that a Mario comic should be handled differently than what I said, that's fine. In fact, tell me why, because I'm curious to see what kind of takes on this topic are out there, because this idea makes me excited. Could you imagine the kind of stories they could tell with characters like Rosalina, Fawful, Geno, the Shroobs, Dark Bowser, the Mario Galaxy stuff? There's so much potential for fun stories because Mario's universe is so incredibly vast and unique in so many different ways. But that's about all I have and can say about this hypothetical Super Mario Bros. Comic. Like, subscribe, all the things that tells YouTube that I did a good job. Thank you for watching, and I will always be terrible at writing outros.